In the suburbs, everyone knows their neighbors. You wave as you leave for work. You chat over the fence about the weather. You watch each other's children grow up year by year, birthday party by birthday party. And you never suspect that the friendly face next door might be capable of the unthinkable. Imagine a perfect summer morning in Colorado. The sun is rising over suburban streets lined with neat homes. Children's bicycles lean against garage doors. Basketball hoops stand ready in driveways. It's the kind of neighborhood where people move to raise families, where crime is almost non-existent, where the biggest worry is whether someone's lawn needs mowing. Now imagine that on one of these streets, in one of these houses, something terrible has happened during the night. A pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters, ages 4 and 3, are missing. Their husband and father stands in the driveway, talking to police, saying he has no idea where they could be. He seems worried, cooperative, confused. He lets officers search the house. He answers their questions. But something isn't quite right. His neighbor noticed it first. The way he's acting, the things he's saying, how he's explaining too much, talking too fast, not watching the security footage that might help find his missing family. Within 48 hours, everything will change. The worried husband will become a suspect. The missing persons case will become a murder investigation, and one of America's most horrifying family annihilations will be revealed in all its brutal detail. This is the story of Christopher Watts, the man who seemed perfect, the father who murdered his family, the killer next door. Prologue. The American Dream, Frederick, Colorado. Frederick is a small town about 30 miles north of Denver, with a population of around 12,000 people. It's the kind of place families move to for good schools, safe streets, and affordable housing. The median household income hovers around $90,000. The crime rate is practically non-existent. It's boring, peaceful, normal. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where nothing bad ever happens, where life moves at a comfortable, predictable pace. In 2013, Christopher and Shanann Watts moved to Frederick from North Carolina, purchasing a 5-bedroom home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. The house was new construction in a development called The Woodlands, one of those suburban neighborhoods where all the houses look similar, where HOA rules keep lawns trimmed and garbage cans hidden, where children play in cul-de-sacs and neighbors organize block parties. The Watts seemed like the perfect family. Christopher Lee Watts, Chris to friends and neighbors, was 28 when they moved to Colorado. Tall, fit, quiet, he worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, an oil and gas company. The job paid well enough to support his growing family. He was reliable, punctual, the kind of employee who showed up on time and did his work without complaint. Shanann Catherine Watts was 29, vibrant and social where Chris was reserved. She worked from home as an independent representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing company that sold health and wellness products under the brand name Thrive. Shanann was active on social media, Facebook particularly, posting frequently about her life, her business, her family. Photos of Chris and the girls, videos of family outings, updates about her Thrive business. To anyone scrolling through her Facebook page, the Watts family looked like they had it all. They had 2 daughters, Bella Marie, born December 17th, 2013, and Celeste Catherine, Cece to everyone who knew her, born July 17th, 2015. Beautiful little girls with their whole lives ahead of them. The neighbors on Saratoga Trail liked the Watts family. Shanann was friendly, welcoming. She'd come over when new families moved in, introducing herself, offering to help. The girls were always laughing, running around, playing. Chris was quieter, not unfriendly, just reserved. He'd wave when you saw him. He'd help if you needed it. But he wasn't the type to initiate conversation. They seemed normal, happy, blessed. But beneath the surface, beneath the Facebook posts and the smiling photos and the perfect suburban life, cracks were forming. The financial pressure. In 2015, the Watts family filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Despite a combined income of around $100,000, they were drowning in debt, nearly $450,000 in liabilities, credit cards, car loans, the mortgage on their house, which they'd purchased for close to $400,000. Medical bills from Shanann's lupus treatments. The financial pressure was crushing. They emerged from bankruptcy, but the stress didn't disappear. Shanann threw herself into her Thrive business, hoping to supplement their income. She attended conferences, recruited other representatives, posted constantly on social media about the products. Chris worked his shifts at Anadarko, coming home tired, retreating into silence. The marriage was straining under the weight of money problems, work stress, and 2 young children who demanded constant attention. But from the outside, you'd never know. Shanann's Facebook posts showed a perfect life. Date nights, family trips, loving messages about her husband, photos of the girls in matching outfits. The facade held. Until the summer of 2018, when everything began to unravel. Part 1. The Last Weeks. June, July 2018. In June 2018, Shanann discovered she was pregnant with their 3rd child. She was 15 weeks along. It was a boy. They'd already picked out a name. Nico Watts. On June 11th, Shanann surprised Chris with the news, recording his reaction on video to share with friends and family. In the video, Chris seems pleased, if not ecstatic. "That's awesome," he says, kissing her. "I guess when you want to, it happens." But something in his expression doesn't quite match his words. There's a distance there. A flatness. Friends who watched the video later would notice it. Chris wasn't as happy as he should have been. That same month, June 2018, Chris Watts met a woman at work named Nico Kessinger. She was a contract employee for Anadarko Petroleum, working on environmental projects. She was single, attractive, into fitness and outdoor activities, and she had no idea Chris was married with 2 children and another on the way. Chris didn't tell her. He wore no wedding ring. When Nico asked about his family situation, he said he was in the final stages of a divorce, that he and his wife were separated, that they were working out custody arrangements. It was a lie, but Nico believed it. They began an affair. Chris started going to the gym more frequently. He lost weight, toned up, paid more attention to his appearance. He and Nico would meet for dates, dinner, hikes, time at her apartment. He'd tell Shanann he was working late or meeting friends. Shanann noticed the changes but didn't immediately suspect an affair. She thought maybe Chris was just trying to get healthier, to lose the weight he'd gained over the years of marriage and kids. But she also noticed him becoming more distant, less affectionate, more irritable. In late July, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina for a 6-week visit with her family. She'd planned the trip months earlier, a chance for Bella and Cece to spend time with their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. A break from the Colorado heat. Chris stayed in Frederick, working and spending time with Nico Kessinger. While Shanann was in North Carolina with the girls, Chris was living a different life. He'd go to work during the day, then meet Nico in the evenings. They'd have dinner together, go to her apartment, spend the night. He was attentive, romantic, present in a way he hadn't been with Shanann in years. Nico would later tell investigators that during this time, Chris seemed like a completely available bachelor. He never mentioned his wife or kids, except to say the divorce was proceeding. He talked about his future, maybe moving to a different state, starting fresh, living a simpler life. He Googled things like how to start a new life and how much does a separation cost. Back in North Carolina, Shanann was growing increasingly concerned. Chris wasn't calling as often. When they did FaceTime, he seemed distracted, distant. She'd ask what was wrong, and he'd say nothing. He was just tired from work. She confided in friends that something felt off, that Chris was acting strange, that she worried he might be having an affair, though she had no proof. On August 7th, Shanann sent a friend a long text message expressing her fears. She talked about how Chris had changed, how he didn't seem interested in the pregnancy, how he'd told her he wasn't sure they were compatible anymore. She was scared, but she was also determined to fix her marriage. She planned to have a serious conversation with Chris when she returned home. On Sunday, August 12, 2018, Shanann and the girls flew back to Colorado. Chris picked them up from the airport. According to neighbors, the reunion seemed normal. No obvious tension, no arguments. Just a family coming home after a long trip. That evening and into Monday, Shanann attended a work event for Thrive, a multi-level marketing opportunity presentation at a friend's house. She brought Bella and Cece with her. In videos taken that night, the girls looked tired but happy. Shanann looks excited, energized by being back with her Thrive community. Chris stayed home. Later that evening, Shanann and a friend and colleague named Nicole Atkinson drove to the Denver airport together. Shanann was flying to Arizona for a Thrive business trip, a quick overnight event where she'd give presentations and network with other representatives. The trip was important for her business. She'd be gone less than 24 hours. She asked Chris to watch the girls while she was gone. He agreed. At the airport, Shanann texted Chris, "I love you." His response, sent after midnight, "I love you too." It would be the last communication between them. Part 2, August 13th, 2018, early morning, 1:48 a.m. At approximately 1:48 a.m., Nico Atkinson's vehicle pulls into the driveway at 2825 Saratoga Trail. Shanann had fallen asleep during the drive home from the airport. Nicole gently woke her. They chatted for a few minutes in the driveway, making plans to meet later that day for another Thrive event. Shanann grabbed her suitcase and overnight bag from the back of Nicole's SUV. Nicole waited, watching to make sure Shanann got safely inside. Shanann unlocked the front door and entered the house. She turned and waved at Nicole through the doorway. Everything looked fine. Nicole drove away. What happened next can only be reconstructed from Chris Watts' later confessions, and even those accounts changed multiple times, so we may never know the complete truth. What we know for certain, within the next few hours, Shanann Watts would be dead, and so would Bella and Cece. Morning, what the neighbors saw. At approximately 5:27 a.m., Nathaniel Trenastich's home security camera, which faced the street, captured movement at the Watts residence. Trenastich was the Watts family's next-door neighbor. His security camera, positioned to monitor his own driveway and front yard, happened to have a view of the Watts driveway as well. The footage shows Chris Watts' work truck, a white Anadarko petroleum vehicle, backing into the garage. This was unusual. Chris typically parked the truck in front of the house, not in the garage. Trenastich would later tell police he'd never seen Chris back the truck into the driveway like that. For the next several minutes, the camera captures Chris moving back and forth between the house and the truck, loading items. The angle doesn't show exactly what he's loading. The truck blocks the view, but he's clearly putting something into the cab of the truck, not the truck bed. At 5:46 a.m., the garage door closes. At 5:47 a.m., Chris's truck pulls out of the driveway and drives away, turning left onto Steeple Rock Drive. What the camera footage proves, crucially, is that no one else left the house that morning. Shanann's car remained in the garage. No one walked out the front door. The only person who left 2825 Saratoga Trail on the morning of August 13th was Chris Watts. And he wouldn't return until hours later, when police were already there searching for his missing family. Morning and afternoon, the workday. Chris Watts arrived at the Anadarko petroleum worksite at Survey Ranch, a remote oil field about an hour's drive north of Frederick, around 6:30 or 7 a.m. He worked alone that morning. The site was isolated, far from main roads, surrounded by flat, empty prairie. Oil wells dotted the landscape. Massive cylindrical storage tanks, each about 15-20 feet tall, sat in neat rows, holding crude oil pumped from underground. Chris's co-workers would later tell investigators that his behavior that day seemed mostly normal, maybe a bit quieter than usual. But Chris was always quiet, so it wasn't alarming. Around mid-morning, a co-worker came to the site briefly to check on something. He saw Chris working. They exchanged a few words. Everything seemed fine. The co-worker left. Chris was alone again. What happened at the oil site during those hours is something Chris would eventually confess to, though investigators had to piece together the physical evidence to confirm the horrible truth. For now, all anyone knew was that Chris was at work, doing his job, acting normal. Afternoon, 12:10 p.m. Back in Frederick, Nicole Atkinson was growing concerned. She'd been texting Shanann all morning with no response. This was extremely unusual. Shanann was always on her phone, always responding quickly. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for that afternoon, an OB/GYN appointment for her pregnancy. Shanann never missed appointments. At 12:10 p.m., Nicole drove to the Watts house. She rang the doorbell. No answer. She knocked. No answer. She called Shanann's phone. It rang inside the house, but no one picked up. Nicole tried calling Chris at work. He answered. "Chris, I'm at your house," Nicole said. "Shanann's not answering. Her car's here. Is everything okay?" Chris seemed confused, surprised. He said he'd left for work that morning and Shanann had been asleep. He didn't know where she could be now. Maybe she'd gone for a walk. Maybe a friend picked her up. But Shanann's car was in the garage. Her purse was inside. Nicole could see it through the window. Shanann never went anywhere without her purse. It contained her medication for lupus, her wallet, her phone. Something was very wrong. "I'm calling the police," Nicole told Chris. At 1:40 p.m., Frederick police officer Scott Coonrod arrived at 2825 Saratoga Trail to conduct a welfare check. Nicole explained the situation. Her friend hadn't responded to texts or calls all day, had missed her doctor's appointment, and seemed to have vanished from her own home, even though her car was still there. Officer Coonrod approached the house. He knocked. No answer. Chris Watts arrived home from work shortly after, having left the oil site when Nicole called him. He pulled up in his truck, got out, and approached the officer. "I don't know where they are," Chris said. "This is really weird." He agreed to let Officer Coonrod search the house. They entered through the front door. Part 3. The Search. Officer Coonrod, accompanied by Chris Watts and Nicole Atkinson, walked through the house. Everything looked normal, neat, tidy, no signs of struggle or foul play. Shanann's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her phone inside it. Her car keys were there too. Her wedding ring, which she wore constantly, was on the nightstand in the master bedroom. Nicole pointed this out to the officer. She would never leave without her purse, she said. Her lupus medication is in there. She needs it. Upstairs, the bedrooms looked undisturbed. The girls' beds were made, toys were put away. The master bedroom showed no signs of anything wrong. The officer checked closets, bathrooms, the basement. Nothing. The family dog, Dieter, a black and white mixed breed, was in the house, seemingly undisturbed but needing to go outside. It was as if Shanann, Bella, and Cece had simply vanished. Officer Coonrod asked Chris when he'd last seen his family.
"This morning, around 5:15, Chris said. "When I left for work, Shanann was in bed, the girls were sleeping." "And you haven't heard from her since?" "No, she hasn't answered my texts." The officer asked if there had been any marital problems, any reason Shanann might leave. Chris hesitated, then said they'd had an emotional conversation the night before about possibly separating, but nothing that would make her just disappear. Did she have friends she might be with? Family? Chris suggested a few names. The officer began making calls. Meanwhile, Nicole was growing more agitated. This wasn't like Shanann. Something terrible had happened. She could feel it. Officer Coonrod decided to canvass the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. He knocked on the door at 2828 Saratoga Trail, the house next door, where Nathaniel Trinastich lived with his family. Trinastich answered. Yes, he had security cameras. Yes, he'd be happy to review the footage. They went into Trinastich's living room, where he pulled up the security camera feed on his television. Chris Watts followed them inside, standing awkwardly in the room, watching as Trinastich queued up the footage from early that morning. And there it was, 5:27 a.m. Chris's truck backing into his driveway. Chris loading items into the truck, the garage door closing, the truck driving away. Officer Coonrod watched carefully. "What were you loading?" he asked Chris. Chris shifted from foot to foot. "Tools," he said, "for work. I had a lot of equipment to bring to the site." "Why'd you back the truck into the garage? Your neighbor says you don't usually park there." "It was easier," Chris said, speaking quickly. "Easier to load everything. I had my lunchbox, my backpack, water jugs, computers, tools. Just easier that way." Trinastich and Officer Coonrod exchanged a glance. The footage showed something else too. No one else left the house that morning. If Shanann and the girls had left, they hadn't left on foot or in any vehicle captured by the camera. As they watched the footage, Chris kept talking, explaining every movement, why he'd walked back and forth, what he was carrying, how he usually does things differently, but today was special because he had so much to load. He was explaining too much, his words tumbling over each other, his body language nervous, rocking back and forth, not really watching the screen, glancing at his phone. After Chris left the room to speak with another officer outside, Trinastich turned to Officer Coonrod. "He's not acting right," Trinastich said quietly. "He's being weird. And here's another thing. I've heard them fighting before, flat out screaming at each other. He gets crazy." Officer Coonrod made a note of this. The welfare check was quickly becoming something more serious. By late afternoon, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, had been notified. An endangered missing alert was issued for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts. Local news picked up the story. Pregnant mother and 2 young children missing from Frederick. Last seen early morning on August 13th. Investigators began working through the timeline, interviewing friends and family, pulling phone records, checking surveillance footage from nearby businesses and homes. Chris Watts was cooperative, maybe too cooperative. He answered questions, provided access to his phone and computer, allowed searches of the house and vehicles. He seemed concerned but off, detached, like he was going through the motions of worry without actually feeling it. That evening, as the sun set and Shanann and the girls were still missing, investigators sat down with Chris for a more formal interview at the Frederick Police Department. The questioning was gentle at first. Tell us about your relationship with Shanann. Any problems? Any reason she might leave? Chris talked about financial stress, about possibly separating, about how Shanann had been in North Carolina for 6 weeks and things felt different when she came back. But he insisted, I love my family. I want them home. I don't know where they are. Investigators noticed something. Chris talked about his wife and daughters in the past tense. Shanann was always happy. The girls were great kids. Was, not is. Were, not are. It's a subtle linguistic cue, but to experienced interrogators, it's significant. People who believe their missing loved ones are still alive typically use present tense. People who know they're dead slip into past tense. The interview ended late that night. Chris drove home alone to his empty house. The investigation continued through the night. Part 4, August 14th, 2018, The Appeal. On the morning of August 14th, just over 24 hours after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, Chris Watts did something that would later be analyzed frame by millions of people. He gave a television interview. Denver 7. News had reached out, asking if Chris would be willing to make a public appeal for information. Many families of missing persons do this, appearing on camera, pleading for their loved ones to come home or for anyone with information to come forward. Chris agreed. The interview was conducted on the front porch of 2825 Saratoga Trail. Chris stood facing the camera, the reporter asking questions off screen. He wore a grey and purple Rockies baseball shirt. His body language was stiff, awkward. He kept his hands behind his back or folded in front of him. His face showed almost no emotion. If they're out there, just come back, Chris said, his voice flat. If somebody has them, just bring them back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. He talked about how the house felt empty without them, how Bella and Cece should be there running around, laughing. But something was missing from his performance. Genuine emotion. He didn't cry. His voice didn't break. He barely seemed upset at all. It was like watching someone read lines from a script they didn't quite understand. To investigators watching, particularly CBI agent Tammy Lee, who would become instrumental in breaking this case, Chris's demeanor was a massive red flag. I knew right then, Agent Lee would later say. I watched that interview and knew we needed to get him into an interrogation room as soon as possible. The public's reaction was mixed. Some people felt sympathy for the worried father, but many, especially those with experience in true crime or law enforcement, immediately found Chris suspicious. Social media lit up with comments. "He's not acting right. Where are the tears? Why is he so calm? He did something to them." The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. While Chris was giving his television interview, investigators were digging into his digital life. Phone records, computer history, GPS data from his truck and phone, text messages, social media. And they found something significant. Chris Watts had been having an affair. Nico Kessinger, a co-worker at Anadarko. The affair had been going on since June. Phone records showed they'd been in constant contact, texting, calling, meeting up. Chris's truck GPS showed regular trips to her apartment. On the day Shanann disappeared, August 13, Chris had texted Nico multiple times. He'd asked to FaceTime with her that morning, just hours after his family vanished. And here's what made it more damning. Nico's internet search history showed some disturbing queries around the time of the disappearance. Man finds out his wife pregnant. How to take out a car loan. Apartment for rent. It looked like she'd been planning a future with Chris. A future that couldn't happen if he was still married with 3 kids. When investigators contacted Nico on August 15th, she was shocked. She'd had no idea Shanann was still living in the house. Chris had told her they were separated, that the divorce was nearly final. "He told me his wife was gone," Nico said, "that they were working out custody. I never would have dated him if I'd known." She agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. The affair gave investigators a motive. Chris wanted a new life with Nico. His pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were obstacles to that new life, but they still needed proof. They needed to break him. Part 5, August 15th, 2018. The Confession. On August 15th, 2 days after the disappearance, Chris Watts agreed to take a polygraph test. His father, Ronnie Watts, had flown in from North Carolina that morning. Chris picked him up from the airport, and together they drove to the Frederick Police Department. The polygraph was administered by a CBI agent. Chris was asked a series of control questions, then questions specific to the case. Do you know where your wife is? Do you know where your daughters are? Did you harm your wife? Did you harm your daughters? Chris answered no to all the key questions. But his physiological responses, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, galvanic skin response, told a different story. He failed spectacularly. When the examiner told Chris he'd failed the test, Chris became visibly agitated, not angry or defensive, but nervous, frightened. "These tests aren't always accurate," he said. "I didn't do anything." Investigators moved him into an interrogation room. CBI agent Tammy Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder led the interrogation. They'd spent the previous 2 days building their case, gathering evidence, constructing a timeline. Now they had Chris in a room and they weren't letting him leave until they had answers. They started gently, building rapport, expressing empathy, "We know you're going through something difficult," Agent Lee said. "We can see that. We just want to understand what happened." They walked through the timeline again. "What time did you wake up? When did you leave for work? What did Shanann say?" Chris stuck to his story.
Shanann was in bed when he left for work around 5:15 a.m. The girls were sleeping. Everything was normal. Then the agents shifted tactics. "Chris, we know about Nico," Agent Coda said. Chris's expression changed. This was something he hadn't expected them to know about. "We've talked to her," Agent Lee continued.
"She told us everything. About the relationship. About how you told her the divorce was almost final. About how you were planning a future together." Chris stammered, tried to explain. It wasn't serious. It was just something that happened. Shanann didn't know. "But that's not true, is it?" Agent Lee pressed.
Shanann did know. You told her Sunday night that you wanted a separation. That's why she was upset. The agents could see Chris crumbling. The facade was cracking. They showed him the neighbor's security footage again. "This is you loading your truck at 5:27 a.m. What were you loading, Chris?"
"Tools for work." "Chris, we know that's not true. We can see how you're moving. That's not how someone loads tools." They pressed harder, showed him the phone records, the text messages, the timeline that didn't add up. "Your daughters are out there somewhere, Chris. Bella and Celeste. If they're alive, we need to find them now. Every minute we waste, their chances of survival go down. If you know where they are, you need to tell us." Chris was crying now, shaking, his hands over his face. "I need to talk to my dad," he said. The agents made a calculated decision. Let him talk to his father. Sometimes family can get through when law enforcement can't. Chris and his father, Ronnie, sat in the interrogation room alone, though of course the conversation was being recorded. What Chris told his father in those moments would change everything. "Dad, I did something," Chris said, his voice breaking. "Shanann is gone. I killed her." Ronnie was stunned.
"What? No, Chris, what are you saying?" Chris told his father a story, one that would later prove to be a lie, but in that moment, it was enough to break the case wide open. He said he and Shanann had gotten into an argument Monday morning when he told her he wanted a separation. The argument woke up Bella, who came into the bedroom. Chris claimed he went downstairs briefly, and when he came back up, he saw Shanann strangling Celeste on the baby monitor. He ran upstairs and found Bella dead or dying. In a rage, he said, he strangled Shanann. Then, he claimed, he put all 3 bodies in his truck and drove to the oil site, where he buried Shanann and hid the girls' bodies in oil tanks. It was a story designed to paint Shanann as the villain, the mother who killed her own children, and Chris as the father driven to murder by grief and rage. Investigators knew immediately it was a lie, but it was a confession nonetheless. Chris agreed to show them where the bodies were. At 11:40 p.m. on August 15th, Chris Watts was arrested on suspicion of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Part 6. The Truth Emerges. August 16th, 2018. The Recovery. The next morning, investigators drove Chris to the Survey Ranch oil site. He directed them to the locations. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave, only partially covered with dirt. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn when she arrived home from the airport. A black shirt and blue thong-style underwear. No bra, no pants. Bella and Celeste were inside the oil tanks, large cylindrical containers used to store crude oil. The opening at the top of each tank was only 8 inches in diameter. Chris had pushed his daughter's small bodies through those narrow openings, dropping them into tanks filled with crude oil and water. It took hours to recover the bodies. Workers had to drain the tanks first, then use specialized equipment to extract the remains. The scene was horrific, the worst many investigators had ever seen in their careers. When Bella and Celeste's bodies were finally recovered, covered in oil, it became clear these children had not died quickly, and the story Chris had told about Shanann killing them was impossible. The autopsies would reveal the full horror. Dr. Michael Doberson, the Weld County coroner, performed the autopsies. Shanann Watts died from strangulation, marks around her neck consistent with manual strangulation, someone's hands squeezing her throat until she died. She had defensive wounds, scratches, broken nails, showing she'd fought back. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head as well. Critically, Shanann had died at home, likely in her bedroom. She had not killed her children. That story was a lie. Bella Watts died from smothering. Her little body showed signs of trauma, a bitten tongue, a cut inside her lip, oil in her stomach and throat, indicating she'd been alive when placed in the tank, ingesting oil before she died. There were scratches on her body. She'd fought. In Chris's later confession, he would admit Bella had asked, "Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cece?" before he killed her. Her last words were, "Daddy, no." Celeste Watts died from smothering. Same manner of death as her sister, also had oil in her system. The medical evidence told a horrifying story. Chris Watts had strangled his wife while she slept in their bed. Then he'd smothered his 2 daughters, possibly at home, possibly during the drive to the oil site, possibly at the site itself. His story about Shanann killing them was a complete fabrication. Investigators processed the Watts home as a crime scene. In the master bedroom, they found evidence supporting the strangulation. Blood spots on the pillowcase where Shanann had been sleeping. Hair and fibers consistent with a struggle. On the bed they found Shanann's wedding ring, removed either by her or by Chris after she was dead. In the garage, luminol revealed blood traces that had been cleaned up. Chris's truck was processed. Fibers, DNA, traces of oil from the girls' bodies were found in the cab and on the seats. At the oil site, investigators found Chris's lunchbox, sunglasses, and a receipt from a convenience store he'd stopped at the previous evening. Everything pointed to premeditation. Chris hadn't snapped in a moment of rage. He'd planned this. Part 7. The Media Storm. August 16th,
21, 2018. News of Chris Watts' arrest exploded across media. Headlines screamed the horror. Father confesses to killing pregnant wife and 2 daughters. Colorado man arrested in deaths of family he reported missing. Bodies of Shanann Watts and daughters found at oil site. The story had everything that captures public attention. A seemingly perfect family, a shocking betrayal, innocent children, the facade of normalcy hiding pure evil. Cable news ran 24-hour coverage. Nancy Grace, Dr. Phil, and countless true crime shows dissected every detail. Social media exploded with theories, outrage, and grief. Shanann's Facebook page became a memorial site, flooded with comments from strangers mourning a woman they'd never met, but felt they knew through her posts. Videos of Bella and Cece laughing, playing, singing went viral, each one breaking hearts worldwide. The Thrive community rallied around Shanann's memory. Her friends posted tributes, shared memories, expressed disbelief that Chris could have done this. And that television interview, the one where Chris had appeared on the front porch claiming he wanted his family back, was replayed endlessly, analyzed by body language experts, dissected frame by frame by amateur detectives on Reddit and YouTube. Everyone could see it now. The lack of genuine emotion, the past tense language, the inability to make eye contact with the camera. The signs had been there all along. Nico found herself at the center of a media firestorm she'd never anticipated. When news broke about the affair, public opinion turned on her viciously. She was labeled a homewrecker, a mistress, even an accomplice, though investigators found zero evidence she'd had any knowledge of or involvement in the murders. Internet sleuths combed through her social media, posting her photos, her address, her workplace information. She received death threats. Her name became synonymous with betrayal. Nicole cooperated fully with investigators, giving them access to her phone, computer, and communications with Chris. She submitted to multiple interviews, took a polygraph test which she passed, and maintained consistently that she'd believed Chris when he said he was separated and getting divorced. "I thought I was dating a single guy who was almost done with his divorce," she told investigators, crying. "I had no idea. If I'd known, I never would have." Her internet searches before the murders, particularly how much does a separation cost, were scrutinized. But investigators concluded these were the searches of someone who believed her boyfriend was getting divorced, not someone planning a murder. After the case concluded, Nico entered witness protection, changed her name, and disappeared from public life entirely. The woman who'd unknowingly dated a family annihilator couldn't escape the stain of her association with Chris Watts. Shanann's family, her parents Frank and Sandra Razuchek, her brother Frankie, were shattered. They'd flown to Colorado immediately after learning Shanann was missing. They'd stood with Chris during those first 48 hours, believing he was a grieving husband and father. They'd comforted him, supported him, never suspecting. When he confessed, the betrayal was complete. Sandra Zuchek would later describe the moment she learned the truth. I fell to my knees. I couldn't breathe. My babies, my girls, all of them gone. And he stood there and let us think they might still be alive. Frankie Razuchek, Shanann's brother, had considered Chris a friend, a brother. Learning what Chris had done, not just the murders, but the calculated deception, the lies while their bodies were decomposing in oil tanks, filled him with a rage that had nowhere to go. Chris Watts' family, his parents Ronnie and Cindy, his sisters, faced a different nightmare. They'd believed Chris's initial story that Shanann had killed the girls and he killed her in response. Even after evidence proved this was impossible, Chris's mother clung to the narrative, suggesting Shanann must have provoked him, must have done something to drive him to murder. The victim blaming would later become a source of additional pain for the Razuchek family. Not only had Chris killed their daughter and granddaughters, but his family refused to acknowledge Shanann as the victim she was. The two families, once connected through marriage, would never speak again. Part 8. The Full Confession. February 18th, 2019. Prison interview. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional sentences for other charges. He was sent to Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Colorado. Prisoners are sometimes housed out of state for safety reasons. For months after his sentencing, Chris maintained his original story, that Shanann had killed the girls and he'd killed her in rage. But investigators, particularly CBI agent Tammy Lee, knew this was a lie. The physical evidence didn't support it. The timeline didn't work. The medical findings contradicted it. In February 2019, Agent Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder traveled to Wisconsin to interview Chris again. They'd developed a rapport with him during the investigation. They believed he might finally tell the truth if approached correctly. And they were right. Over 5 hours, Chris Watts gave his full confession. The real story, the one he'd been hiding for 6 months. It was worse than anyone had imagined. What really happened August 13th, 2018. Chris began by admitting his first confession that Shanann had killed the girls was a complete lie. "I made that up," he said. "None of that happened. I'm the one who did everything." He described the night of August 12th into the early morning of August 13th. Shanann had come home from the airport around 1:48 a.m. She'd entered the house, put down her things, and come upstairs to bed. Chris was awake, waiting. She tried to talk to him about their relationship, about his distance, about what was wrong between them. She'd sensed during her time in North Carolina that something had fundamentally shifted. The conversation was brief. Chris was cold, withdrawn. He told her he wanted a separation. Shanann, hurt and confused, eventually fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., Chris strangled her. She woke during the attack, fought back. That's where the defensive wounds came from, but Chris was stronger. He squeezed her throat until she stopped breathing. When it was over, Shanann Watts lay dead in her bed, 15 weeks pregnant with their son. Chris sat there for a moment, processing what he'd done. Then he heard movement from the girls' rooms. 4-year-old Bella had woken up, possibly hearing sounds of struggle. She came into her parents' bedroom and saw her mother's body on the bed. "What's wrong with Mommy?" she asked. Chris told her Mommy wasn't feeling well, that they were going to take her to the hospital. This is where Chris's confession becomes almost unbearable to hear. He wrapped Shanann's body in a bedsheet and carried her downstairs. Bella followed, confused and frightened. Chris put Shanann's body in the back seat of his truck, which he'd backed into the garage. That's what the neighbor's security camera had captured. He told Bella to get in the truck. They were going to take Mommy to the hospital. Bella climbed into the back seat, next to her mother's body. Chris went back inside and got 3-year-old Celeste, who was still sleeping. He carried her out and placed her in the truck as well. Then he drove to the Survey Ranch oil site, a 45-minute drive through the darkness. Bella was awake for the entire drive. She asked questions. "Is Mommy sick? Where are we going? What's wrong with Cece?" Chris didn't answer most of them. He later told investigators she knew something was wrong. They arrived at the site around 5:30 or 6 a.m. The sun was beginning to rise. Chris pulled the truck up near the oil tanks. He got out, leaving Bella and Celeste in the truck. Cece was still asleep, Bella awake and frightened. First, he dragged Shanann's body from the truck and buried her in a shallow grave he dug near the tanks. Then he returned to the truck. He took Celeste out first. She was asleep. He smothered her, hands over her face until she stopped breathing. Then he took her small body to one of the oil tanks, climbed the ladder, and pushed her through the 8-inch opening at the top. Her body fell into the oil and water below. Finally, he came for Bella. By now, Bella knew. She'd been sitting in the truck alone while her father buried her mother and killed her sister, 4 years old, and she understood that something terrible was happening. Chris would later tell investigators the words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "Bella asked me, is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cece? And I said yes." He smothered Bella, his firstborn, his daughter who'd looked up to him, who'd trusted him, who'd watched everything unfold and known her father was going to kill her. Her last words as she struggled were, "Daddy, no." Chris pushed Bella's body into the second oil tank next to where her sister's body lay. Then he drove back home, showered, and went about his day as if nothing had happened. During the prison interview, investigators asked Chris the question everyone wanted answered. Why? Why murder your pregnant wife? Why kill your 2 beautiful daughters? Chris's answer was chilling in its simplicity. "I wanted a fresh start. I wanted to be with Nikki. I didn't want the girls. I didn't want another baby. I didn't want any of it anymore." He talked about how he'd felt trapped in his marriage, how the financial pressures were overwhelming, how he'd fallen in love with Nico and couldn't see a way to have the life he wanted with her while still being responsible for Shanann and the kids. Divorce, he said, would have been expensive. Child support for 3 kids would have been crushing. Shanann would have been angry, vindictive. It would have been messy. This was cleaner. In Chris Watts's mind, murdering his entire family was more convenient than getting a divorce. Part 9. The Trial That Wasn't. November 6, 2018. The plea deal. Chris Watts never went to trial. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to 9 counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder, Shanann, Bella, Celeste. 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, Bella and Celeste. 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy, Nico. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. The plea deal was offered by prosecutors with the agreement of Shanann's family, who wanted to spare themselves the trauma of a trial and ensure Chris could never appeal or escape justice. The death penalty was taken off the table in exchange for the guilty plea. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 for the murders of Shanann, Bella and Celeste, 2 additional for murdering children under 12, 48 years for unlawful termination of pregnancy, 36 years for tampering with deceased bodies, all sentences to run consecutively. He will die in prison. At sentencing, Shanann's family had the opportunity to address Chris directly. Frank Rzucek, Shanann's father, spoke through tears. "I trusted you to take care of them, and you killed them. Those kids looked up to you. You were their world, and you destroyed them." Sandra Rzucek, Shannan's mother, could barely speak. "I will never understand how you could do this. I will never forgive you. My daughter loved you. Those babies loved you, and you threw them away like garbage." Frankie Rzucek, Shannan's brother, addressed Chris with barely controlled rage. "Your life is over. You will never have a moment of peace. Every day for the rest of your life you'll wake up in a cell knowing what you did, and I hope it destroys you." Throughout the statements, Chris sat motionless, staring at the table. He showed no emotion, offered no apology, said nothing. Judge Marcelo Kopkow addressed him directly before pronouncing sentence. "This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled in my career. You ended 4 lives and caused immeasurable suffering to families and friends. You don't deserve to be among free people." Chris was led away in shackles. He would never walk free again. Part 10. Aftermath and Analysis. The house on Saratoga Trail, 2825 Saratoga Trail, the house where the Watts family had lived, where Shanann was murdered, where Bella witnessed her mother's death, became notorious. Shanann's family couldn't bear to return to it. The house sat empty for months, becoming a grim tourist attraction as people drove by to gawk, take photos, leave flowers on the doorstep. In 2019, the house was quietly sold at auction for significantly less than market value. The new owners have renovated it extensively and requested privacy. But for those who know the address, it will always be the Chris Watts house,
a place where unspeakable evil occurred behind a facade of suburban normalcy. In 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door, a documentary about the case assembled entirely from social media posts, police body cam footage, text messages, and security camera footage. The documentary became one of Netflix's most watched true crime releases, viewed by millions worldwide. It painted a portrait of Shanann Watts as a loving mother who documented her life in real time on social media, never knowing those videos and photos would become evidence in her own murder case. Critics argued the documentary exploited tragedy. Supporters said it honored Shanann's memory and exposed the reality of family violence. The case has been featured on countless true crime shows, podcasts, YouTube channels, and social media discussions. It sparked broader conversations about family annihilators, men who kill their entire families, the danger of appearing perfect on social media while hiding relationship problems, how co-workers and friends missed warning signs, the psychology of men who see their families as disposable obstacles. Chris Watts's name became synonymous with a particular kind of evil, not the random violence of a stranger, but the calculated betrayal of someone you trusted completely. Where are they now? Chris Watts remains in prison in Wisconsin. He's given multiple interviews to authors and crime investigators, always seeking attention, always revising his story slightly, always centering himself in the narrative. Nico vanished from public life. She changed her name, moved to an undisclosed location, and has never given a public interview. She lives under the shadow of being the other woman in one of America's most notorious murder cases, though investigators cleared her of any involvement. The Rzutchek family lives quietly in North Carolina, trying to rebuild lives shattered by unbearable loss. They've established the Shanann Watts Foundation to help victims of domestic violence. They don't speak publicly often, but when they do, they emphasize Shanann was a victim. The girls were innocent. This was not about marital problems. It was about Chris's choice to murder rather than divorce. The Watts family remains divided. Chris's mother continues to suggest Shanann somehow provoked the murders. His father has been more subdued but maintains contact with Chris in prison. The Watts family's inability to fully acknowledge Chris's guilt and Shanann's innocence has kept wounds open. Forensic psychologists have studied Chris Watts extensively, trying to understand what drives a family annihilator. Dr. Lena Derhally, a psychologist who wrote a book about the case, identified several factors. Narcissism. Chris couldn't tolerate anything disrupting his desired self-image. When his affair with Nico made him feel young, attractive, and free, he couldn't return to being boring Chris with the struggling marriage and financial problems. Compartmentalization. Chris lived in separate mental boxes. Work Chris, family Chris, affair Chris. He never integrated these identities, making it easier to dispose of one box when it became inconvenient. Lack of empathy. Chris showed classic signs of severely diminished empathy. He could intellectually understand others had feelings, but he couldn't emotionally connect to their suffering.
even his own daughters. Entitlement. Chris believed he deserved happiness, and anything standing between him and that happiness, including his wife and children, was expendable. But none of these factors, alone or together, fully explain how a father could smother his 4-year-old daughter while she begged him not to. Some aspects of human evil remain beyond the reach of psychological explanation. Epilogue: The Monster Next Door. The Chris Watts murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we think we know. Chris Watts was not an obviously disturbed individual. He had no history of violence, no criminal record, no documented mental illness. His co-workers described him as quiet and reliable. His neighbors saw him as the guy next door, unremarkable, maybe a bit bland, but harmless. He coached his daughter's activities. He helped friends move furniture. He went to barbecues and birthday parties. And then, in a single night, he revealed himself to be capable of the most horrific family violence imaginable. There were warning signs, but they were subtle. The affair. But millions of people have affairs without murdering their families. Financial stress, but millions of families struggle with money without violence. A controlling personality, but Chris seemed passive, not controlling. The emotional detachment in his interview, but some people just aren't emotional on camera. No single red flag screamed, "Family annihilator." The danger only became obvious in hindsight. Shanann's extensive social media presence became both a blessing and a curse for the case. The blessing. Her videos, photos, and posts provided investigators with a detailed timeline of the family's life, relationships, and Chris's changing behavior. They documented Shanann's love for her family, her efforts to save her marriage, her excitement about the new baby. The curse. Armchair detectives analyzed every post, looking for clues they claimed showed Shanann was overbearing, controlling, or somehow complicit in her own murder. Victim blaming reached disturbing levels as people dissected her social media presence and found fault with how she lived her life online. The case became a cautionary tale about our digital age. Everything we post can be weaponized, analyzed, and misinterpreted after we're gone. In all the analysis and discussion, it's crucial to remember the smallest victims, Bella and Celeste. Bella was 4 years old. She loved playing with dolls, watching movies, and spending time with her little sister. She was old enough to understand something terrible was happening during those final hours. She asked her father if he was going to kill her too, and he said yes. Cece was 3 years old. She loved singing, dancing, and making people laugh. She died without understanding what was happening, smothered while she slept. Both girls trusted their father completely. They had no concept that the person who was supposed to protect them would be the one to end their lives. And Nico, the baby who never got to be born, who never drew a breath, whose short existence was ended before it truly began. 4 lives, 4 futures, all destroyed by one man's selfishness. Christopher Lee Watts will spend the rest of his life in a cell in Wisconsin, far from Colorado, far from the oil site where he disposed of his family, far from the home where he murdered them. He'll never be free. He'll never have the life he thought he wanted with Nico Kessinger. He'll never experience the fresh start he murdered his family to achieve. Instead, he'll grow old in prison, his name forever associated with unthinkable evil, his face a symbol of domestic violence and family annihilation. And somewhere in that prison cell, does he feel remorse? Does he grieve for what he destroyed? Those who've interviewed him say he seems to feel sorry for himself more than for his victims. He talks about how hard prison is, how much he misses the outside world, how he wishes things had gone differently. But genuine remorse for Shanann, for Bella, for Cece, for Nico, if it exists, it's buried beneath layers of narcissism and self-pity so deep that it might as well not exist at all. In the end, this story isn't about Chris Watts. He doesn't deserve to be the center of attention, though he craves it. This story is about Shanann Catherine Watts, 34 years old, who loved her family fiercely, who worked hard to build a good life, who believed in her marriage even when it was failing, who came home from a business trip excited to fix things with her husband, and who was strangled to death while she slept in her own bed. Bella Marie Watts, 4 years old, who loved her daddy, who trusted him completely, who witnessed her mother's murder and knew she was going to die next, and who begged her father to spare her life before he smothered her. Celeste Catherine Watts, 3 years old, who died without understanding what was happening, whose small body was pushed into an oil tank and left there for days alone in the darkness. Nico Lee Watts, who never got the chance to be born, to be held, to be loved. They were real people. They mattered. They deserved better. And they deserved to be remembered not as the Watts family victims, but as individuals whose lives had value far beyond the horrible way they ended. On August 13, 2018, Evil walked through a suburban home in Frederick, Colorado, wearing the face of a husband and father. On November 19, 2018, justice was served, imperfect and incomplete, but served nonetheless. Christopher Watts will never be free again, but Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico will never come home. Sleep well, if you can, and remember to check on your loved ones, and never assume you truly know what's happening behind your neighbor's closed door.